Empathy is rarely an accident. It is often a quiet adaptation forged in the emotional climate of early life, where a child learns that safety is not guaranteed, but must be sensed, predicted, and managed before it fully arrives. In homes where emotions are unpredictable, where love may be present but inconsistent, or where tension lingers beneath ordinary moments, a child's nervous system becomes exquisitely attuned to subtle shifts, because missing those signals once may have felt like too great a risk. This is not a conscious choice. It is the body's intelligence shaping perception in real time, teaching the child to read between words, to notice what is unsaid, to feel what others try to hide, even from themselves. The empath, then, is not simply someone who feels deeply. They are someone who learned early that feeling deeply was necessary. They learned that connection depended on understanding others better than those others understood themselves. They learned that harmony required vigilance, that love sometimes required self-erasure, and that their own needs could wait because someone else's emotional state seemed more urgent, more fragile, more powerful. This is how empathy begins to intertwine with survival until it no longer feels like a skill but an identity. And yet, beneath this sensitivity, there is often a quiet cost, because when a child becomes responsible for the emotional atmosphere around them, they lose the freedom to simply be. They become watchers instead of participants, caretakers instead of children, interpreters of energy instead of explorers of their own inner world. They may grow up praised for their kindness, for their maturity, for their ability to understand others, without anyone asking what it required of them to become that way. No one sees the moments when they silenced themselves, when they swallowed confusion, when they carried feelings that were never theirs to carry. Over time, this pattern becomes internalized, and the empath moves through life with the same orientation, scanning, sensing, adjusting. They enter relationships already tuned to the other person's needs, often before recognizing their own. They feel discomfort not as a signal to protect themselves, but as a call to fix, to soothe, to restore balance. They may attract people who are disconnected from their own emotions, because the empath unconsciously fills that gap, becoming the emotional translator, the stabilizer, the one who holds what others cannot yet face. But this dynamic, while familiar, is not inherently healthy. It perpetuates a subtle imbalance where the empath continues to give without receiving the same depth of understanding in return. And because this pattern feels normal, even necessary, it can persist for years, sometimes a lifetime, unless it is gently brought into awareness. The crucial realization is this: the empathy that once ensured connection can, if left unexamined, lead to disconnection from the self. The same sensitivity that reads others so accurately can overlook the inner signals that say, "This is too much," or "This is not mine to hold." The empath may feel exhausted, overwhelmed, even resentful, without fully understanding why, because they have been taught, implicitly, that their role is to endure, to adapt, to prioritize others. Yet the origin of this pattern holds the key to its transformation. When the empath begins to see that their sensitivity was shaped by early experiences, not simply bestowed as a fixed trait, something shifts. There is a softening of self-judgment, a recognition that what they became made sense given what they lived through. And from that place of understanding, a new possibility emerges: the ability to choose how that sensitivity is expressed now. This does not mean losing empathy, it means reclaiming it. It means allowing that same awareness to turn inward, to notice one's own emotional landscape with the same care and curiosity once reserved for others. It means recognizing that the child who learned to scan for danger also needed safety, also needed to be seen, also needed permission to exist without performing. And in adulthood, that need does not disappear. It simply waits to be acknowledged. As this awareness deepens, the empath begins to differentiate between what they feel and what belongs to others. They start to sense the boundary where their experience ends and another's begins, not as a barrier, but as a form of clarity. They realize that understanding someone does not require absorbing them, that compassion does not demand self-sacrifice, and that presence is more powerful than overextension. This shift can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because it challenges long-held beliefs about what it means to be caring or connected. There may be moments of guilt, of hesitation, of questioning whether stepping back is a form of abandonment, but in truth, it is an act of alignment, a way of restoring balance where there was once only giving. And something remarkable happens when empathy is no longer tied to survival. It becomes freer, more intentional, less burdened by the need to fix or manage. The empath can listen without losing themselves, can support without depleting themselves, can care without carrying what is not theirs. Their presence becomes grounded rather than reactive, steady rather than overwhelmed. What once emerged from necessity begins to evolve into something more conscious, more integrated. The early environment may have shaped the empath's sensitivity, but it does not have to define its limits, because within that same sensitivity lies the capacity for awareness, and within awareness lies the freedom to respond differently. And in that freedom, empathy is no longer a wound dressed as a gift, but a genuine expression of connection that includes the self as much as it includes others. To feel deeply is often mistaken for weakness, as though the intensity of emotion were something excessive that needs to be reduced, controlled, or hidden. But the burden is not in feeling itself. It is in carrying feelings without understanding them, without context, without a place for them to land. When sensitivity exists without awareness, it becomes overwhelming, like standing in the middle of a storm with no sense of direction, no grounding, no way to discern what belongs to you and what does not. The empath does not just feel their own emotions, they feel the unspoken tensions in a room, the suppressed grief in another person, the quiet anxiety behind a forced smile. And without awareness, all of it blends together into a single, heavy experience that feels impossible to escape. This is where the burden begins, not because the empath feels too much, but because they have not yet been taught how to understand what they feel. They absorb emotions as if they are their own, internalizing the pain of others, believing it is their responsibility to make sense of it, to resolve it, to somehow restore balance. Over time, this creates a kind of emotional exhaustion that is difficult to name because it is not tied to a single event or a clear source. It is the accumulation of everything that was felt but never processed, everything that was taken in but never released. And so the empath begins to protect themselves in the only ways they know how. They may withdraw, not because they do not care, but because caring has become too costly. They may numb themselves, disconnecting from their own emotions in an attempt to reduce the intensity of what they experience. Or they may continue giving, hoping that if they can just help enough, fix enough, understand enough, the weight they carry will finally make sense. But none of these responses address the core issue, which is not the presence of feeling, but the absence of awareness. Awareness changes everything. When awareness enters the experience of feeling, something begins to shift. The empath starts to notice that not every emotion they feel originates within them. They begin to sense the difference between what arises internally and what is picked up externally. This distinction is subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grows stronger with attention. And as it does, the overwhelming flood of emotion starts to separate into individual streams, each with its own source, its own meaning, its own place. This is the moment where the burden begins to transform into a gift. Because awareness does not remove feeling, it gives it structure, context, and clarity. It allows the empath to remain open without becoming lost, to feel deeply without being consumed. It introduces the possibility of choice, where before there was only reaction. Instead of immediately absorbing and responding to every emotional signal, the empath can pause, observe, and decide what is theirs to engage with and what is not. This does not make them less compassionate. It makes their compassion more sustainable. Without awareness, empathy can become a form of self-abandonment, where the needs and emotions of others consistently take precedence over one's own. But with awareness, empathy becomes an extension of presence, not a sacrifice of self. The empath can remain connected while still maintaining a sense of internal stability. They can witness pain without taking it on, support others without losing their own center. This is not an intellectual process, it is an embodied one. It requires the empath to turn their attention inward, to become as curious about their own emotional landscape as they have always been about others. It asks them to notice how their body responds, how certain interactions leave them feeling drained or energized, how their internal state shifts in different environments. This kind of awareness is not immediate. It develops over time through consistent attention and a willingness to stay present with what is uncomfortable. And this is where the deeper transformation occurs. Because as the empath becomes more aware of their own experience, they begin to uncover the layers of feeling that were previously overshadowed by the emotions of others. They start to recognize their own unmet needs, their own unprocessed pain, their own desires that may have been set aside in the effort to maintain connection. This can be confronting, even unsettling, because it challenges the identity that has been built around being there for others. But it is also liberating, because it reveals that the empath's depth of feeling was never the problem. It was the lack of space to understand and integrate that feeling. And once that space is created, the same sensitivity that once felt like a burden becomes a source of insight. The empath can perceive not only what others are feeling, but why and how those feelings connect to broader patterns of human experience. They develop a kind of emotional intelligence that goes beyond surface-level understanding, allowing them to engage with others in a way that is both compassionate and grounded. This is the gift of awareness. It does not eliminate pain, but it changes the relationship to it. It allows the empath to hold emotion without being defined by it, to experience intensity without losing clarity. It transforms empathy from something that happens to them into something they can consciously engage with. And in that shift, the very thing that once felt like a weight becomes a source of strength, a way of connecting that is both deep and sustainable. The empath no longer needs to choose between feeling and functioning, between caring and protecting themselves. They begin to see that these are not opposing forces, but aspects of the same capacity when held with awareness. Feeling becomes information rather than overwhelm. Connection becomes mutual rather than one-sided, and presence becomes a place of stability rather than vulnerability. And in this space, the empath discovers that their sensitivity was never meant to be endured as a burden, but understood as a language, one that, when learned, reveals not only the emotions of others, but the deeper truths of being human. There is a quiet pattern that often goes unnoticed in those who feel deeply, the instinct to reach outward before they have learned how to stay with themselves. It begins with good intention, with a genuine desire to reduce suffering in others, to offer comfort, to be the one who understands when no one else seems to. Yet beneath this impulse, there is often an unspoken assumption that healing is something that happens through action toward others, rather than through attention toward the self. And so the empath steps into roles of support, care, and emotional holding long before they have learned how to hold their own inner world with steadiness. What is rarely acknowledged is that this outward orientation is not always rooted in strength. In many cases, it is rooted in familiarity. When a person has spent early life attuned to the emotions of others, responding to their needs, adapting to their moods, the center of gravity slowly shifts away from the self. Over time, internal signals become secondary, almost background noise, while external emotional cues become primary. The empath learns to read others with remarkable precision, yet remains unfamiliar with the quieter language of their own needs, boundaries, and emotional limits. This is where the subtle distortion begins. Because when someone has not yet learned how to recognize their own pain, they often become highly sensitive to the pain of others. It is easier to locate suffering outside the self than within it. It feels safer to engage with external wounds than to sit with internal ones that may have been long avoided. And so helping others becomes not only an expression of care, but also a way of staying distant from one's own unresolved emotional landscape. The act of healing others can quietly become a form of distraction from the parts of the self that have not yet been met with presence. But true healing does not move in only one direction. There comes a point where the empath begins to notice a subtle exhaustion that does not resolve through rest alone. It is not simply physical tiredness. It is emotional depletion that persists even in moments of stillness. They may find themselves feeling overwhelmed by the very sensitivity that once felt like a gift, as if the weight of others' emotions has begun to blur the edges of their own identity. This is often the first signal that something deeper is asking for attention, not in the external world, but within. Healing self before healing others is not a withdrawal from compassion, it is the restoration of its foundation. Because when a person has not yet tended to their own emotional wounds, their capacity to hold others is inevitably limited by what remains unprocessed within them. Unacknowledged pain has a way of influencing perception, even when it is not consciously recognized. It can lead to over-identification with others' suffering, to rescuing behaviors that are not fully grounded, or to emotional entanglement that blurs the boundary between care and absorption. Without inner stability, empathy can become reactive rather than conscious, driven more by unresolved patterns than by clear choice. But when attention turns inward, something begins to reorganize. The act of healing self is not a single event. It is a gradual process of returning to places within that were once avoided, misunderstood, or overwhelmed. It involves learning to sit with discomfort without immediately escaping it, to feel emotions without rushing to fix or externalize them, to recognize that what arises internally does not always require action, but often requires presence. This presence is not passive. It is deeply active in its willingness to stay, to witness, to acknowledge without judgment. In this process, the empath begins to rediscover parts of themselves that were set aside in the effort to remain attuned to others. Needs that were once suppressed begin to surface. Boundaries that were never fully formed begin to take shape. Emotions that were previously absorbed on behalf of others are slowly returned to their rightful place. There is often resistance at first because the identity built around being the helper, the listener, the one who understands, can feel threatened by this inward turning. Yet beneath that resistance lies a deeper truth, that sustainable connection with others cannot exist without connection to the self. As inner healing progresses, perception changes. The empath begins to recognize that not every emotional experience they encounter is theirs to carry. They start to differentiate between compassion and absorption, between being present with someone and taking responsibility for their emotional state. This distinction is subtle but transformative. It allows care to remain intact without becoming self-erasing. It allows listening without losing orientation. It allows support without collapse. And perhaps most importantly, it introduces choice. Where there was once automatic response, there is now awareness. Where there was once compulsion to fix, there is now the ability to pause. Where there was once confusion between helping and overextending, there is now clarity. This does not diminish empathy, it refines it. It brings it into alignment with reality rather than impulse. Healing self also reshapes the emotional field within relationships. As the empath becomes more grounded in their own experience, they begin to attract and participate in dynamics that reflect this grounding. Relationships that once relied on imbalance begin to shift or dissolve. Interactions that required overfunctioning begin to feel unsustainable. In their place, new forms of connection emerge. Ones where emotional responsibility is shared, where presence is mutual, where understanding does not require self-neglect. This transition is not always comfortable. It often involves moments of loneliness as old patterns fall away before new ones are fully established. It may involve grief for versions of connection that were familiar, even if they were not healthy. It may involve the discomfort of no longer being needed in the same way, or the fear that without overgiving, connection might not remain. Yet, within this uncertainty lies the foundation of something more stable, more reciprocal, more true. Because healing self before healing others is not about becoming separate from humanity. It is about becoming more fully present within it. It is about arriving in connection not as someone who is trying to compensate for inner fragmentation, but as someone who is increasingly whole. And from that wholeness, empathy no longer functions as a drain, but as a clear channel of understanding that does not require self-abandonment to remain open. Pain, when left unexamined, tends to fold inward and become identity. A quiet assumption that what was endured defines what must continue to be carried. But pain is not inherently meant to remain static within a person. It is movement, signal, and pressure, seeking expression, understanding, and ultimately integration. For those who feel deeply, especially those who have learned early to absorb emotional environments, rather than simply observe them, pain often arrives not as a single event, but as a continuous atmosphere, shaping perception long before it is ever named. And when this kind of pain is not met with awareness, it can feel like a private weight that isolates the individual even in the presence of others. Yet within that same sensitivity that experiences pain so fully lies the very capacity that allows transformation. The empath does not only register suffering, they register nuance, context, emotional undercurrents, and the unspoken dimensions of human experience. This means that pain is never just raw sensation for them. It is layered with meaning, memory, and relational imprint. And while this depth can feel overwhelming, it also contains the potential for something profoundly generative, because what is deeply felt is also deeply understood when given the right conditions. The turning point is not the absence of pain, but the way pain is held. When pain is held unconsciously, it tends to repeat itself through patterns of relationship. reaction, and internal dialogue. It can lead to cycles of overgiving, emotional entanglement, withdrawal, or self-neglect, all attempts by the system to manage what feels unmanageable. But when pain is brought into awareness, when it is witnessed without immediate judgment or escape, something begins to shift in its structure. It stops being purely an internal burden and starts becoming information about unmet needs, past adaptations, and present boundaries that require recognition. This is where pain begins its transformation into purposeful connection, because connection, in its most authentic form, is not built on the absence of suffering, but on the capacity to meet it consciously. When a person has encountered their own pain with honesty, without bypassing or denial, they develop an unusual depth of presence with others. They are less likely to be thrown into reaction when witnessing suffering in someone else, because they are no longer unfamiliar with their own. This familiarity does not create numbness, it creates steadiness. It allows the empath to remain open without becoming overwhelmed, to listen without dissolving, to witness without collapsing into the experience of the other. Pain that has been integrated becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. It allows the empath to meet others, not from a place of trying to fix what they once feared in themselves, but from a place of recognition. There is a subtle but profound difference between rescuing someone from suffering and standing with them in it. One is driven by urgency and discomfort, the need to remove pain as quickly as possible, often because it mirrors something unresolved internally. The other is rooted in presence, the willingness to remain connected even when resolution is not immediate, even when discomfort is still present, even when answers are not yet formed. This shift changes the quality of connection entirely. When pain has not been transformed, connection can become conditional, dependent on emotional roles being maintained. The empath may unconsciously become the container for others' emotions, absorbing what is unprocessed in the people around them, believing this is what it means to care. But when pain has been met within the self, connection no longer requires absorption. It becomes spacious. It allows two nervous systems to coexist without merging, two emotional landscapes to be witnessed without collapse into one. In this space, something remarkable happens. Suffering becomes shareable without becoming overwhelming. This does not mean that pain disappears or becomes less real. It means that it no longer isolates in the same way. When someone has learned to sit with their own emotional intensity, they are less afraid of the intensity in others. They do not interpret it as something to escape or suppress, but as something to understand. And this understanding creates a different kind of relationship, one that is grounded in authenticity rather than avoidance, in presence rather than performance. Transforming pain into purposeful connection also involves recognizing that not all suffering requires immediate solution. This is a difficult realization for those who have built their sense of worth around being helpful, responsive, or emotionally available. There is often an ingrained belief that to care means to act, to intervene, to change the emotional state of another, but mature connection understands that presence itself is often the most stabilizing force. To remain with someone in their experience without trying to override it can be more healing than any attempt to fix it prematurely. It communicates something deeper than solutions ever could, that the other person is not alone in what they feel. And yet, this capacity cannot be sustained without internal grounding. If pain has not been transformed within the self, the empath will eventually reach a threshold where their openness becomes depletion. They will begin to feel fragmented, overwhelmed, or disconnected from their own center. This is not a failure of empathy. It is a signal that empathy is being expressed without integration. When pain is not metabolized internally, it inevitably leaks into relational space as overextension, fatigue, or emotional confusion. But when pain is processed, acknowledged, and understood within, it no longer demands to be acted out externally. Instead, it becomes a source of insight. It informs the empath about what is needed in a given moment, where boundaries are required, where presence is appropriate, and where separation is necessary for clarity. This discernment is what allows empathy to become sustainable rather than depleting. It transforms emotional sensitivity from something that overwhelms into something that guides. Over time, this transformation changes not only how the empath relates to others, but how they understand human experience itself. Suffering is no longer viewed as something to escape at all costs, but as something that carries intelligence when approached with awareness. It becomes clear that pain often points toward areas of life that require attention, truth, or change. And when this is understood, the empath is no longer at the mercy of emotional intensity. They become someone who can move within it with awareness, someone who can stand in difficult emotional landscapes without losing orientation, someone who can offer connection that is both deeply felt and clearly held. And in this way, what once fractured the sense of self becomes the very ground through which deeper, more authentic connection becomes possible.